Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this loose watercolour landscape scene. It's a beginner friendly scene and I'm trying to get the effect of sunlit fields and shadows. I'm starting off as I always do with a loose pencil sketch. Just very quickly indicating where my middle ground trees, my distant tree line and my foreground trees will be. And that's all I need, just a nice simple sketch so that I can have a bit of a guide as I paint. I'm going to be using the wet in wet process to paint the sky. I'm using Milford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board and my board's at an angle of about 20 degrees, so gravity will help as I paint. So I'm wetting the sky all over with my Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch modeler brush, and I'm bringing a little bit of Venetian red, light value, across into the sky first, and then coming across with a stronger mid to dark value cobalt blue and allowing the two colours to sort of marry and mingle on the page. Trying to leave a few gaps where I've got paler areas so I get a nicely diffused, interesting looking sky where the light red should give me some grey and almost sort of violet hues, pinkish hues in this sky to evoke late afternoon light. While this is a beginner-friendly demo for loose watercolour painting, it may take a few goes, a few practices to get it right or something similar, but I'm hoping that what I'm demonstrating here are going to be transferable skills that you can aspire to and practice so that you can achieve these sort of loose watercolour washes. I've now dipped into sap green and a bit of my cobalt blue, and I'm now putting in those distant trees while the sky is still wet in that area. I've kept the value quite light and quite bluish because hopefully that means that distant tree line will recede into the distance. I've now strengthened that mix up with a richer, drier mix of sap green with a bit of lemon yellow to put in the middle ground trees. These trees are deciduous trees that I've put in with the corners of my wash brush. Now I'm using the tips of the wash brush and I've added some indigo and a bit of sepia to my green just to darken it up. And now I'm putting in these coniferous trees, or maybe poplars, but just a slightly different shape of tree. And this adds variety to my middle ground distance. I can keep building up some shadows underneath that heavy foliage. I've deepened the green with sepia and a bit of indigo. I'm going to clean up that tree line now with a clean, damp 3/4 inch flat brush. This just will soften that off and clean up that line, and that will make a nice contrast when I put in my sunny field a little bit later. But the next thing I'm going to do is put in the undergrowth and all the sort of brambles and weeds that are growing around my foreground trees over on the left. Using the same brush and dipping into sap green, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and a little bit more of the sort of indigo and sepia, just building up some rough texture to bed my trees into. I'm going to scrape some grasses through the rich paint with my palette knife. Now this is like drawing with a palette knife, so I'm just drawing in sticks and twigs, grasses and weeds and brambles, creating lighter marks through the rich paint, and this adds to the texture in the foreground, suggesting that foreground detail. Now working up into the damp paint with my palette knife just to start off the shape of these large foreground trees, their main branches and tree trunks. And then I'll just scratch a few in to the mid-ground tree line as well while that's just still damp. It could be a really nice way of just indicating features without painting detail. Now here's lemon yellow, dragged straight across that distant field with a 1.5-inch flat brush, leaving some dry brush sparkle there and dipping into sap green and dragging that across the foreground so I get the transition from lemon yellow, where the sun's hitting that field, to the slightly deeper green, which we shall place shadows on a bit later. And now working a darker mix of cobalt blue, a little bit of indigo and burnt sienna around some of those marks for that foreground area. And I've laid my board flat so the washes don't run any further, and this is a little pot of ordinary fine table salt. I'm going to sprinkle just a little bit into this foreground overgrown area, and I'm hoping that a few little subtle salt effects will give me some added texture to the foreground. And I just need to leave it to dry. And here's the dry painting. It stood back up at about 20 degrees again. I've brushed off any remaining salt crystals that didn't dissolve, and you can see I've got some nice textures in the foreground. And I've made a nice dark mix of sepia and cobalt blue, and I'm using a number 2 quill brush to paint in my foreground tree trunks and branches. Sorry my hand's in the way, but you should be able to see what I'm doing. I'm just working around the marks that I etched in earlier with the palette knife and painting using the wet on dry method. So I'm painting with nice rich paint onto the dry paper, so I'm not getting any diffusion, nice hard edge marks, and that will give me the definition that I need in this foreground tree. So I'm starting off with this number 2 quill brush. It's got a nice point, it holds plenty of paint. A bit later on I can move on to a rigger brush to paint in some of the finer branches. And this is a size 2 rigger brush. I think it's a Pro Art one. Had it for years. But any sort of lining brush will do this job for you, so that you get some sort of nice spontaneous and fresh looking finer twigs at the end of all the branches. Then back to my 1.5-inch modeler brush, and I've just dipped into a mixture of sap green that's been made a little bit more earthy and desaturated with some burnt sienna, and I'm just touching lightly around the edges of the twigs, trying to leave plenty of gaps and some dry brush effects to give a light covering of leaves and foliage over the branches and twigs. I want to be able to see that sky through the foliage here. Taking the palette knife, scraping through that paint. This gives me lighter marks that contrast nicely with those darker branches and twigs that I painted with the darker mixture. And everything that I can do to add a little bit of simple variety to this foreground tree will really sort of help with the effects of it sort of looking fairly realistic and complex, but in actual fact being very sort of loose and simply painted. Back to the rigger brush, a few more little sticks and twigs and things. I found a nice sort of muddy mid-value green on my palette from all the colours that I've used so far, and using my number 2 quill brush I'm just going to start to put in a bit of shadow across this area, and then drag some shadows following the shape of the land, which slopes slightly uphill from left to right, and creating shadows from these trees across this field, and then some shadows from more trees that are out of sight or out of the picture, trying to make sure that my undergrowth around the foreground tree is sort of shadowed as well, but still trying to keep a little bit of colour beneath those shadows. And as well as describing the direction of the hill, these shadows really help to make the middle ground distant field pop. It makes that light really stand out nicely. Now building up a little bit more dark and shadow, and a few more sticks and twigs. So at the moment it's a balancing act, just trying to bring the painting together because it's almost done. So I'm just trying to make sure I've got enough darks in this foreground area. And then I'll have to balance up a few more darks across the middle ground area in a bit. And then I'll need a few more branches here and there. So I'm defining some of those tree trunks and branches. Just a few little flicks with the rigger brush, nothing too strong. So I'm working backwards and forwards along this middle ground tree line, just putting in a few flicks of the brush here and there, strengthening up some of the trunks or suggestions of trunks. And then I'm going to just put in a bit more of a sort of dark, just build it up gently and slowly around the base of the trees a little bit more. Using the side of the brush now, just scraping it across the texture of the paper to build up the darker shadows, trying to keep them sort of fairly soft edged. Now I'm going to dip into my dark colour again and using the rigger brush, bringing those tree trunks down a few millimetres into that bright yellow field so that you can see where the tree trunks are growing out of the edge of the field, and then taking that darker green and the rigger brush still, dragging some shadow brush strokes from each tree trunk. And that's the painting just about done. But before I remove the tape and show you how it looks, I'd just like to take this opportunity for a quick plug for my book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner. It's suitable for beginners and intermediates with lots of helpful techniques about general watercolour painting and 10 step-by-steps, 5 pure watercolour and 5 line and wash. There are links in the description below if you're interested in finding it, and it's available from all good bookstores. So let's remove the tape and see how it looks with a clean white border. This allows us to see it with fresh eyes, and we can see whether we need anything else to be done to it. And I think I need to just work into the tree branches a bit more here and there. First in the middle ground trees with a fan brush, just bringing up a little bit more texture. That's better, but I've made a bit of a mess of my border, so I'll just clean that up with a damp piece of tissue. That's better. And now back to the rigger brush and my lovely dark colour, and I'm going to strengthen up a few of these finer branches here and there. Bring those across the sky a little bit more, just to sort of link one side of the painting to the other. Just a few more across the top, making sure that the paint that I dip into is dark in value but still making very fine marks, and letting it run out on the brush. As I paint these smaller twigs, they get a little bit fainter towards the edges, and I think that's okay. I'm quite happy with that and the way that that now looks. I think the touches of sort of pinky violety grey in the sky really help to evoke that late afternoon feel, but still keeping a nice amount of sunlight gleaming on the distant fields. The subtle shadows across the foreground really help to accentuate the light as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you found it helpful. If you did, then please give the video a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed to our channel, then why not consider doing so? It's free to do, and it really does help with our reach. And if you're interested in advert-free versions of my YouTube demos and in supporting the channel, then follow the link to my Patreon page, and you can find the link there to Morgana's vlog and her Patreon page too. That just leaves me to give a massive great shout out and thank you to everybody that supports us on our Patreon channels. We really do appreciate you. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.